Hi, fifth graders, welcome back. Today we are reviewing Unit 3 content on the 13 American colonies. Our goals for today are to describe the colonial groups and ways that the American colonists impacted Native Americans. So first, let's figure out where in the world we are. So we right now are right here in New Orleans, but we are learning about Great Britain and the colonies that they created in North America. Those are those 13 American colonies. We know they'll eventually fight for their freedom, and then they will become the United States of America. But for today, we're just going to talk about what were they like as colonies. And so here is a zoomed in map of this area right here. And these are those 13 different American colonies. They're divided up into three colonial era groups: the New England group, the Middle colonies, and the Southern colonies. A couple things we want to know before we get started. In the United States, the farther north you go, and so if you look at this compass rose, north means going up. The farther north you are, the colder it is. The farther south you go, the warmer it is. And if we think about that, that makes sense. We're right here in Louisiana. Louisiana is very, very south, and it is so hot in Louisiana in the summers, and our winters don't get very cold. But if we were to go visit Massachusetts way up north, it's still really cold over there, and that's because they're farther north. So first, let's talk about these New England colonies, these northern colonies. So the religion of New England was Puritan. The Puritans believed that the way that they worshiped their religion was right, and people had to follow that religion. So in the New England colonies, they were very strict. Colonists were only allowed to practice the Puritan religion. Colonists who tried to practice other religions were kicked out and had to go somewhere else. The motivation for founding a lot of these New England colonies was seeking religious freedom. So they were not allowed to practice their religion in England. And so in order to practice freely, they said, fine, we'll go to the New World and we'll practice there. So they got religious freedom in the Americas, but then they only allowed their religion to be practiced in the colonies. They did not allow religious freedom for others once they got there. And the economy and the environment. Economy is how they made money, and environment is the land around them. We're going to see for all three of these colonial groups, the environment, the geography of the area will affect how they make money. So because the New England colonies are so far north, it's cold there. They have freezing cold winters and only mild summers. These cold winters and rocky soil made it really difficult to farm. They had really short growing seasons. It just wasn't good for farming. So they found other ways to make money. They did things like shipbuilding, fishing, and trading. Those were all important for important economic activities. And that was good because the New England colonies have a lot of trees, and so they could cut down the trees and use that for shipbuilding, and they could trade that lumber. All right, so here is a picture of the New England colonists coming in from the Mayflower. The Pilgrims settled in a New England colony. And remember, they are very, very religious, and they only allow people to practice their Puritan religion. So Puritans are super strict. Here's a picture of what the New England colonies would look like in the winter, and it's what New England looks like in the winter now today. So if we were to go visit New England in this winter, it'd be snowy. And here's a picture. There are a lot of mountains in that area. Let's look back at that map again. You see all these mountains here along the side. That led to the soil being very, very rocky and difficult to farm in. And here we see that rocky soil. It would be really tough to farm in this area. Since the environment didn't let them farm, they had to find another way to make money. And they did that with shipbuilding, trade, and fishing. All right, so that was New England. Now we're going to learn about the middle colonies. And so if we know it's colder up north and it's hotter down south, the middle colonies are somewhere in between that. They're not too hot and not too cold. It's what we call mild. So the religion of the middle colonies is that they were Quakers. Quakers believed that freedom of religion was important. The Quakers welcomed anyone, including Native Americans. The Quakers were one of the few groups that didn't try to force the Native Americans to practice their own religion. So we're comparing the Puritans in New England to the Quakers in the middle colonies. The Quakers were much more tolerant. They allowed other religions. The Puritans did not. So motivation for the middle colonies to be founded, there were a lot of different motivations, but we're going to focus on William Penn, who was a Quaker who founded the Pennsylvania colony, and he wanted to have a place where there was religious tolerance and for people to start a new life. And the economy and environment. The land of the middle colonies was pretty fertile, so farming things like wheat was important. There were also many forests, so shipbuilding and paper making were also important. The middle colonies get nicknamed the breadbasket because they farmed things like wheat. Um, Let's look at some pictures. So here we have a picture of the middle colonies with Native Americans. You see that the groups are getting along. The middle colonies had much better relations with the Native Americans than the other colonial groups. Here's a picture of wheat farming in the middle colonies. So the middle colonies did not only farm. Farming was not the most important thing. And we saw here, like other things like shipbuilding and paper making were also really important. They used their forest resources. But because they farmed so much wheat, they were known as the breadbasket of the colonial region. And there we go, that you use wheat to make bread. So when we think of the middle colonies, we think of mild, we think of tolerant, and we think of wheat. And so now let's talk about the southern colonies. And we know if it's colder up north, it's hotter down south. This area is going to be hot. And when we think about how our geography influences the way that we live, uh, a lot of plants that are cash crops like cotton and sugarcane, they love really, really warm environments. So it's not only just hot in this area, but there are also a lot of rivers, and these rivers leave behind fertile soil and fresh water for farming. So the religion of the southern colonies, religion really was not all that important, but most of the people in the southern colonies were Protestant. They're not going to be really strict like in New England, and they're not really going to worry. They don't even really, it's not like a big thing to the southern colonies. So motivation for founding these southern colonies. Many British people came to the southern colonies looking to get rich or wealthy. Many Africans were forced to come to the southern colonies against their will. So a large percentage of the population actually comes from Africa, but those people were stolen from their homes and forced to work as enslaved people. And so a little bit about how the environment impacts the economy. Because they have warm climate, they have rich soil, they have those rivers, and it rains a lot. Cash crops like cotton and indigo were grown on large plantations, and those large plantations used slave labor. So because the climate allowed farming, there was a lot of farming. Because they needed people to work the farms, they imported enslaved people from Africa. So when you think of the southern colonies, think of how sunny and warm it is. Think of the farming of cash crops like tobacco, sugar, and cotton. And think of the enslaved people who were forced to work on those farms. All right, take a minute to reread your notes and compare and contrast all three of these colonies. So put what makes New England unique, the middle colonies unique, southern unique, and all of them together. What do they all have in common? So here are a couple of things that you could have put. The New England, we know it had a cold climate, so they don't do a lot of farming. New England had rocky soil and shipbuilding. They had pilgrims. They had strict religion, and their religion was they were Puritans. The middle colonies, you should have put that they had a mild climate. They had that fertile soil, which led to wheat farming. But we should have also, I should have put this on here too. They did other things too, like shipbuilding and uh, paper making. They were Quakers, and Quakers believed in religious tolerance, being tolerant or allowing other religions. The southern colonies, we know we had hot climate, fertile soil, rivers, slavery, and religion was not as important. One thing to note here, the southern colonies did have the most slaves or enslaved people, but the middle and New England colonies were not innocent. They also had enslaved people. The reason why they didn't have as many as the southern colonies is that they didn't need them as badly. You don't need enslaved people to build ships, but you do need a lot of people to work on a plantation to grow cash crops. So the geography of the southern colonies led to those colonists needing more enslaved people. And we're seeing here that the colonies, their geography is influencing their settlement patterns, how they settle and how they live. People also adapted to their environment. They realized that in the southern colonies, they could farm more, so they did farm more. Something they all had in common is that they were all English colonies. They all came from Great Britain, so they spoke the same language and had similar culture. And they all had democracies. We're going to learn more about that later this or next week. A democracy we know is when people participate by voting. All right, and now let's shift gears and talk about how all of the colonial groups, remember they're located here, got along with the Native Americans. If the 13 colonies were located here, the two Native American groups they interacted with the most were the Northeast Natives and the Southeast Natives. And so remember, those are the groups, both of them have a good bit of farming. The Northeast does a lot of hunting in the woods. The natives were living in the land that was colonized by the British. So the British didn't just show up and see empty land. They saw villages and tribes and people who had been living there for centuries. However, when the colonists got there, they took land and resources from the natives. So they would find villages like this where trees had already been cut down and either force the natives out or wait for the natives to die of the European diseases and then take their lands. The European colonists didn't have to work as hard as the natives did to establish their homes early on. The colonists tried to justify this. They argued that the natives had plenty of land and there was very little land in Great Britain, so the British needed this land. It is true that there was not a lot of farmland in Great Britain, and so they did need the farmland in the Americas, but I still don't think that that really justifies taking someone's land. But that is what the British told themselves when they were doing it. The natives were really angry to have land taken away from them. They also felt that the colonists destroyed forest habitats and they polluted the environment. This led to the two groups fighting a lot over land. So there were a lot of disputes over who owned which land. And that was especially hard for native groups that would move around to a lot of different areas, and they wanted to keep all those areas pure and clear for them to use. Europeans would take over a lot of land and chop down trees in order to have their farm animals graze. This was really challenging for natives who were used to hunting animals in this area. So if they're cutting down the trees, then the animals that lived in the forest are going to go away. So overall, the impact of Native Americans on, or I'm sorry, the impact of Europeans on Native Americans was pretty negative. They took away their land, they spread their diseases with the natives, and the two groups often fought a lot fighting over that land. All right, you don't have a space with these questions, but on your packet, find a space to draw this chart and answer this question right here and fill out the chart. Have a great day.